Yeah, great guru, maestro.
All right, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. And a very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I would like to thank and welcome everyone for joining us today in our IAIS Islamic Civilization Talk Series, ICTS, which is a talk series dedicated to issues related to Islam, civilization, interfaith, peace, and security. So for today's webinar is primarily related to the unfolding developments of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which saw Russia launching its military offensive in Ukraine less than a month ago. This webinar, among others, attempts to delve deeper into the dynamics between global superpowers in the unfolding conflict, but also its ramifications for countries beyond Europe, especially its impact on the politics of peace and security for Europe and beyond Europe, particularly for nations facing prolonged invasions by foreign state actors, including countries such as Palestine, Kashmir, and so forth. So for today, we'll be having two esteemed expert panelists to deliver their presentations on the subject. First, we have Dr. Osi Jajeshi. He is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Civilization, IIUM, specializing in the history of nationalism, Islam, and Muslim communities in post-Ottoman Europe. He has taught history at the University of Alexander Suvani of Elbasan and the University of Alexander Moisiu of Durrës in Albania before joining the IIUM last year. Dr. Osi has been a postdoctoral researcher at York University, Toronto, Canada, and finished his PhD at the European University Institute, Florence, Italy. His research, publications, and investigative work covers the process of radicalization of Muslims in Europe, issues of national identity in the Balkans, the situation of Muslim communities in Xinjiang, China, and the situation of Muslim and Christian communities in Palestine. Dr. Osi has also conducted several studies that analyze the depiction of Muslims and Christians in the Balkans, covering Albania and Kosovo, the historical image of Turkey in the Balkans, and the propagation of Islamophobia in Europe. For the second speaker, we have Dr. Ahmad Al-Muhammadi. He is an assistant professor at the International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, IIUM. He holds various external positions such as Associate Fellow at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, ICCT, The Hague, Netherlands, Associate Research Fellow at the Accounting Research Institute, ARI, the University Technology Mara, and the International Advisory Committee member at the Global Peace Institute, United Kingdom. Since 2011, he has been working closely with the Special Branch, Counter-Terrorism Division, Royal Malaysian Police, and the Prison Department to implement the rehabilitation and de-radicalization programs for individuals detained under terrorism laws in Malaysia. He was also a consultant to the UN Development Program and co-authored a report with Vance Conville, senior consultant at the United Nations, on the return of foreign terrorist fighters in Southeast Asia. Dr. Ahmad also served as a think tank member and consultant to the Institute for Youth Research Malaysia under the Ministry of Youth and Sports Malaysia. So with that, I pass the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Osi. The floor is yours.
All right, assalamu alaikum, and thank you for the invitation. So for our viewers, today we're going to talk about what is going on in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Now, as a teacher of Russian history at the International Islamic University, Malaysia, Department of History, Ukraine is a part of my lectures. I show and I explain to my students how Ukraine has been part of Russian civilization, identity, and how Russian civilization, or the Kievan Rus, was formed in what we know nowadays as Ukraine. The conflict that we have nowadays in Ukraine is as old as Russia is. From the very creation of the Russian kingdoms and princedoms, we have always the Russian Slavs who have centered their power around the city of Kyiv, which nowadays is the capital of Ukraine. And Ukraine has historically been the place where we have the so-called clash of civilizations. Clash of civilization between Russian Orthodox Christianity, the Catholic West, which is represented by Poland, and the Catholic minorities that we have nowadays in Western Ukraine. And of course, during the Ottoman times, until the 18th century, the south of Ukraine, where we have Crimea nowadays, Odessa, and the Black Sea, belonged to the Islamic civilization, where we had the Crimean Tatars. Anyhow, Russians, thanks to their modernization, especially during Tsar Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they managed to build a very powerful state in Europe to defeat the Ottomans, but also the Lithuanians and the Poles, and the territory that we know nowadays as Ukraine became a part of the Russian Empire. Not exactly the Ukraine that we see nowadays, because we have even other regions like Galicia and others, which were added later on to Ukraine. But in few words, Ukraine is a Russian and later on a Leninist or a Soviet creation. The October Revolution in Russia, the coming of the Soviets in power in the Soviet Union, they brought along even the policies of nationalities that were promoted by Lenin and Stalin. And especially Stalin was in a way the person in charge for creating many nations in the ex-Soviet space. So we have nations like the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, the Tajiks and others who before the Soviet Revolution, they had different identities, be them religious or Islamic in the case of Central Asia. And Ukraine falls into this Soviet scheme, like we have in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, where we have a creation of nations like the so-called Macedonians. The same thing happened in Soviet Ukraine. It was the Soviets who united different regions of Soviet Union. The eastern part, which was Russian, the so-called Novorossiya, and the other parts on the east of the Dnieper River that created the so-called Ukrainian nationality. But if somebody goes into the details of the Ukrainian nation, we will understand that this is a recently formed nation where we have many ethnic, religious, cultural divisions. Nevertheless, with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine was in a way tolerated to be a state by the Russians. Nevertheless, the creation of Ukraine was a fake state, like we had Yugoslavia in the Balkans, which was a state which was created by the communists joining different ethnic groups like the Croats, the Serbs, the Slovens, the Bosniaks, and the Kosovars and the Macedonians. The same story happened in Ukraine. And since 1991, Ukraine has been continuously struggling as a state to turn itself from a Soviet republic into a nation state. This is the factor number one. Factor number two is that historically, the eastern part of Ukraine, for people who can probably see the map, so let me just share a map here with you. So for people who can see this map, can you see the map? Can yes, the map? Okay.
Yes, we can.
So this is Ukraine, and here we have Kyiv. This is a map which shows the current military situation and the Russian intervention in Ukraine. So from Kyiv up to the Azov Sea, we have a river which crosses throughout Ukraine, known as the Dnieper River. So this is in a way the dividing or the separating line between Eastern and Western Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine, this area that you can see where the Russian military is operating at the moment, is a Russophone area. And historically, this area had a huge Russian influence. And for people who have studied the history of Ukraine since 1991, this country has been always in a kind of a civil war between the Russian East, which was very pro-Russian, and the Western part, which was dominated by people like Galicians, the Poles, and other Catholic and Union groups who wanted to create a pro-European or pro-Western Ukraine. Now, while the Federation of Russia recognized the existence of Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, historically, they perceived Ukraine as part of their civilization. And for the Russian leadership, it was never accepted that Ukraine will be lost. Because after all, before the Soviet creation of Ukraine, Ukraine was part of Russia, of the Russian Tsardom. And moreover, if we see the littoral space of Ukraine, this area here where I'm moving my mouse around the Azov and the Black Sea, were areas that Russians took forcefully from the Islamic civilization, from the Ottomans, where after taking these areas from Muslims, Russians colonized these areas in the past 300 years with different Christian Orthodox colonists, people who came from the Balkans, from Albania, from Greece, from inner parts of Russia, who the component that had these people for becoming colonists was Christian Orthodoxy. We have to bear in mind that the Russian Empire was a Christian Orthodox empire, in a way an empire which inherited the Byzantine and Christian Orthodox legacy. Now, with the creation of Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became a battleground between two major world empires or superpowers that we have. On one side, we have the Anglo-American Empire headed by United States, and on the other, we have the Russian continental empire. The Russians, they have invested so much in the past 30 years in Ukraine, especially in the Russophone areas of the East, to keep Ukraine as their own satellite. Nevertheless, there was a big problem. Ukraine, since the fall of communism, has been a very corrupt state. And by being a corrupt state, here we had many kinds of oligarchs and many kinds of groups who try to do their best in order to destroy and steal the Ukrainian economy. Now, a big problem that Russia had in the last 30 years with Ukraine was related to the issue of gas. For our viewers, they have to know that Russia is one of the major gas suppliers and petrol suppliers to Europe. Countries like Germany are 80% dependent on their gas resources from Russia. But now what happened is that since 2005, we have a conflict between, or it started actually since 1993, we have a conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. In numerous occasions, Ukrainians, they have stolen Russian gas, and in 2005, they had even major problems with the Russians until this problem reached its peak in 2006, when Russian gas, which was exported to Europe, was stopped by Ukrainians. They didn't allow the Russians to export their gas because they were using, in a way, gas diplomacy as a way to blackmail Russia and to take a very cheap gas, and even to force Russians to pay high fees for the transit that this gas was making from the Russian Federation to Europe. The issue of the conflict of gas have accelerated a lot, even in 2009. And all these blackmails that Ukraine was doing to Russia, and moreover, Ukraine, by joining the camp with other anti-Russian hardline states in Europe, like Poland and the Baltic Sea, forced the Russians in 2014 to come with two solutions. What Russians did, they created two new major gas pipelines to furnish Europe. One was Turk Stream, which started in 2014, where Russia sends its gas from the region of Rostov to Istanbul, and from there it sends it to Europe. And the second one was Nord Stream. Now, the major problem that brought the present conflict in Ukraine is mainly connected to the Nord Stream pipeline system. By seeing that Ukraine is not a reliable partner, the Russians started two major Nord Stream pipelines. The one was inaugurated in 2011, and the other one, which was supposed to be operational by now, but was finished in September 2021, aimed to turn Russia into major gas supplier to Europe and to Germany mainly, but by bypassing Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainian government, which was very unhappy with this, they put the Americans into play. Americans have been very nervous in the last 20 years, especially since the coming of Putin to power in Moscow with the empowerment of Russia. While Russia is not and it is not an industrial power like Germany or China has, in the past years, it became in a way a Saudi Arabia with a nuclear bomb in Europe, which means it became a major source of energy supplies for the Europeans. Now, what the administration of President Vladimir Putin has done in Russia for the past 2 decades was first, Putin tried to make Russia a partner with the Europeans and NATO. There were moments when the Russian government even asked the European Union and NATO to join them and to become part of the Western civilization. Nevertheless, the Americans and the British, they refused this. By following Lord Smythe's dictum, the Secretary General who even created NATO in 1949, the British have fanatically followed his dictum that the objective of NATO in Europe is to keep Americans in, Germans down, and the Russians out. Now, with the completion of Nord Stream 2, there was a great panic in Western circles. And this panic exploded in January 2009, when in the time the US ambassador in Germany, Richard Grenell, he sent letters to companies involved in the construction of the Nord Stream, urging them to stop working with the project or otherwise threatening them with sanctions. These sanctions then continued with a number of bills by the US Congress, where they started sanctioning many German companies and European companies, forcing them to stop cooperating with Russia. Even though the German and European companies were blackmailed, the Russians, they completed Nord Stream 2 by themselves, and work was finished in September 2021. What does Nord Stream 2 means for Europeans and Americans? It means that Germany will fully integrate its economy with Russia, and Russia will be, in a way, the heart of the energy resource for Europe. And this was the dream of Putin, and to integrate Russia into the European civilization and in the European Union. For the construction of Nord Stream 2, Russians spent, together with other European companies like Austrian, the British Shell, France Engie, Germany's Uniper, and Wintershall, they spent, together with the Russian Gazprom, they spent $10.6 billion US. When everything was done, finally, we had the administration of President Joe Biden, who openly blackmailed Germany. They blackmailed Chancellor Angela Merkel and later on Schulz, telling them that there is no way that you are going to open the Nord Stream 2 and turn Russia into the major strategic supplier of Europe with gas. So the war in Ukraine that we have now, that started on the 24th of February of this year, it started as a provocation. The Americans were crazy with the Russians who completed themselves Nord Stream 2, and they needed a reason to provoke a war. And the war actually started in 2014 when the Americans organized the so-called Maiden Revolution, which was a coup against the democratically elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and they installed in power an anti-Russian leadership. Since 2014, the Ukrainian government has enacted a number of anti-Russian policies. The Russophone population, especially of the areas of the so-called Novorussia, but actually starting from Odessa up to Donbas, have been persecuted. Many have been deported from their homes. And the two self-proclaimed republics of Lugansk and Donetsk were continuously shelled, and there were up to 14,000 people killed. Now, starting from 2011, the Americans, they mobilized of getting ready to push the Ukrainian government for attacking Donbas and Lugansk and forcefully taking them back because they declared their independence in 2014. Now, another thing that happened between Russia and Ukraine that we have to mention was that when we had the Maidan Revolution and the coup against Yanukovych, Russia annexed the peninsula of Crimea, which the Russians, they took from Turkey or the Ottoman Empire with the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in time of Catherine the Great. It was Khrushchev who gave Crimea to the Ukrainians, but later on in 2014, when the Russian administration understood that for them was very difficult to keep Crimea under their sphere of influence with the Maidan coup d'etat, which was organized by Victoria Nuland, they decided to annex Crimea. Now, the annexation of Crimea and the declaration of independence of the republics of Lugansk and Donbas were the major starting point of the war that we have now in Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces, they started their attack against these two self-proclaimed republics, and on the other hand, the Russians responded by putting their troops in the border and finally recognizing the independence of these two republics and military intervening in Ukraine. Now, what is the strategy of the Russian intervention in this moment in Ukraine? As President Vladimir Putin has proclaimed, the Russians, they want to achieve two things. Number one is they want to stop the process of Nazification in Ukraine. And the second thing that the Russians want, they want Ukraine to remain neutral. Because what happened with the Ukrainian government in the past months was that the administration of President Zelensky, he and the prime minister, they are Jews and they are Zionists, while the majority of the Ukrainians, they are Orthodox Christians. What they have declared in the past months is that, number one, they wanted to make Ukraine part of NATO. And second, he even threatened with the creation of the atomic bomb in order to blackmail Russia and to serve as a hostile country against Russia. So these were the red lines which the Russian administration could not tolerate. And for this reason, we have what the Russian administration calls as military intervention in Ukraine. On the other hand, the intervention by Russia in Ukraine has caused huge and major alarm throughout the NATO countries, which means Western Europe and North America. And we have, in a way, the start of a new hot war over the future of Ukraine. The map that I showed to you before, that let me share it with you again here, in a way shows the situation on the ground of the Russian army. So this map shows the Russian army, where it stands at the moment. So as you can see, the Russians have, in a way, managed to occupy the littoral areas of the Azov Sea. The Azov Sea is this one here, which belonged to, a good part of it belonged to Ukraine. In 2014, the Russians, they took the Crimean Peninsula, and there are expectations that the Russians are going to even capture the city of Odessa in order to isolate Ukraine from the Black Sea. On the other hand, Russians are continuing with their military expansion in east of Ukraine, and the area that you can see here in rows are areas which at present are under the control of the Russian army, and these areas in general are the Russophone areas of Ukraine. There is a stiff resistance from Ukrainian army and from many international terrorists and mercenaries that have joined the fight with Ukraine. For us who follow the news, we have all the West today mobilizing itself to save Ukraine, but openly NATO cannot enter and to do what they have done with Muslim countries in the past 3 decades. So there are no fly zones, there are no NATO planes over Ukraine like they were in Iraq of Saddam Hussein, or like in Syria, or like in Libya, or like in Yemen, or like in Somalia or Sudan. So for the time being, what the West and the Americans in particular are doing is that they are funding the Ukrainian government, they are supplying it with weapons, and what we're having now at the moment in Ukraine is a very hot war between the Russian Federation, the Russian army, the Ukrainian army, and a huge Western coalition which is supporting the Ukrainians to resist. Now, what is the aim of the Russians with their military intervention? Like Putin declared before the intervention, the aim of the Russians with their intervention in Ukraine is, number one, to defend the Russophone population of Ukraine. Number two is to bring back to Ukraine Russian language as part of the culture and administration of the country. Ukraine, for those people who know Canada, where we have the Anglophone Canada, and on the other hand, we have the Francophone Canada represented by Quebec, they want, and they have begged in the past years, Ukrainians to adopt a kind of Canadian solution for Ukraine. But what has happened in the country since 2014, Russian language has been banned, removed from the schools, Russian TV stations have been closed, and the Russian government says that there was a genocide against Russian speakers. Now, the Russian intervention in Ukraine has been met with what Western analysts call the nuclear option. The West has put Russia under a total embargo. This embargo is much more worse than the embargo that the Trump administration put against Iran when American administration retracted from the Iranian nuclear deal. At this moment that we're talking is Russians cannot fly their planes in Europe, cannot sell gas, cannot sell grain, and cannot even travel. We have the Russian ministers like Foreign Minister Lavrov, who they cannot even board on the plane because they are all on a no-fly list by the NATO alliance. Because of these embargoes, we're having major crises developing throughout the world, and in particular in the West and in Europe, where the price of petrol, for example, for us in Balkans, has reached, if here in Malaysia, 1 liter of petrol is only 2 ringgit, for us in the Balkans, 1 liter of petrol at this moment is 12 ringgit. The price of bread is skyrocketing, because we have to know something, that Russia, apart from being a major energy supplier for Europe, is at the same time a major food supplier. We Europeans do not consume rice like people do in Asia, but we consume bread. And the corn and the flour that we use for bread comes from Russia and Ukraine. 80% of the grain that we consume in the Balkans comes from Russia. At this very moment, because of the American blackmail, countries like Kosovo, like Albania, like Macedonia, like Greece, and what have you, are not allowed to go to the Black Sea and buy grain or even petrol from Russians. So there is a great chaos in the West. There is an economic chaos. There is an energy crisis. There is a food crisis. And very soon we're going to see major food shortages in Europe because of the sanctions that the Americans have put against the Russian Federation. This is, in few words, what I wanted to say, and maybe we can continue later on in the question and answers section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olsi. And now I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Ahmad.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Dr. Olsi, my co-panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the IAIS for inviting me to this discussion, and I welcome everybody to this discussion. I hope that from this discussion we can learn something, and then we can learn it as a lesson. In this discussion this morning, I will like to mention 3 important points. One is what is the best way to understand the conflict which has happened in Ukraine, and the second one is the reason why Russian occupy Ukraine. I would like to extend a little bit of that discussion based on the Dr. Olsi's deliberation. And number 3 is I would like to touch on the Malaysia's position on this issue. So let us go to the first point. I think the best way to understand the global issue, such as the war in Ukraine or the military operation, as the Russians call it, is by understanding several key concepts in the international relation. So I would like to mention 3 important concepts, which is very, very useful for us to understand in order to figure out what is going on at the international world today, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. The first concept is geopolitics. Geopolitics is basically a combination of the word geography and politics, especially related to international politics. So when we talk about geography or geographical location, in international politics, it matters a lot actually, because geography or geopolitics influence relation between states, influence the trade relation, and in turn, as the title of our discussion suggests, it's influence peace and conflict in the world. So in order to understand why, for example, Russia is so interested in Ukraine, we have to understand geopolitics of the European countries and also the geopolitics of Russia and the NATO in this context. So as being deliberated by Dr. Olsi just now, Ukraine is part of Russia based on the identity and based on history and based on politics as well. It has been part of the Russian Empire since the pre-Soviet Union. And in terms of religion as well, they also shared to some extent the same religious belief. And therefore, having Ukraine being part of Russia is very important for them. And if you look at what happened before, for example, during the Cold War, okay, so we can see that Ukraine was part of Russia, part of the Soviet Union. And during that period of time, during the Cold War, so there were 2 pacts in there. One is the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union and also its allies. And on the other hand, we have NATO, that is a Western bloc, which is led by the United States and all European countries and other countries as well, including Turkey. So that was the scenario before. So that was the period in which, during the Cold War, there are two great powers. The bipolarity, meaning that in one hand we have the Soviet Union, and the other hand we have a Russia. So then the situation like what happened today do not exist actually, because in one hand we have Russia, on the other hand we have NATO, and both of them engage in what is called as the Cold War. There is no actual war which is taking place. It's actually is a tension, and the proxy wars, and the war which is not a direct confrontation, like what happened in Ukraine right now. Because in Ukraine we can see that the Russian army is engaging with the Ukrainian army. So in the context of Cold War, the direct confrontation like this did not happen, because both powers, both superpower, the global superpower at that time, possess a nuclear power, and it is impossible for them actually to engage with the frontal or the confrontation like that, because it's going up to be using a nuclear weapon. So during this Cold War period, if I may go back a little bit in history, it is not a problem, because Ukraine was part of Russia, and then Russia feels secured in the sense that it has a very big buffer zone to reach Moscow. But right now, after the Cold War is over, almost 40 years, so the Cold War is over, the Ukraine become independent country, and then right now they choose to be siding with NATO. So in that context, by siding with NATO, it makes Russia feel insecure. So that is the basic idea, because if you look at it based on the map, which is shown by the Dr. Olsi just now, you can see that from Ukraine to Moscow is not far. It's about 500 kilometers between these two points. So it is very near actually, as compared with the United States, for example. It has a natural buffer zone like the Atlantic Ocean. United States was surrounded by the ocean, by the sea. So to reach United States, it takes some time. And then so it gives the time to the United States to respond against any attack. But for the Russia, if Ukraine fall under the influence of NATO, it is very difficult. It put Russia in a very difficult situation, that if anything were to happen to Russian sovereignty, then Russia has no time to respond, because the distance between Ukraine and Moscow, for example, in that context, is only 5 kilometers away. So this is another problem that make Russia feel very insecure, and therefore they have no choice but to. I'm not trying to defend what the Russian did in Ukraine, but what I'm trying to say here is the logic of the action of the sovereign nation against another nation. I will mention about the reason of the occupation after this. Another important concept that we have to understand is the national interest. As you can see right now in international politics and diplomacy, somebody become friend or country become friend and enemy is actually because of the national interest. So in the context of the invasion of Russia, for example, is actually to protect its national interest, to protect the security of Russia against the expansion of NATO. Well, actually, before the breakup of the Soviet Union, there was an agreement between USSR and NATO that, okay, we will allow the East Germany to be united with West Germany, but with the condition that there is no expansion. Even though people say that this kind of agreement did not exist, meaning that NATO never promised to Russia that it will never enlarge into the eastward. But for Russia, it's actually envisioned to see that NATO will never move eastward, meaning that it move closer to Russia, because by doing so, is actually make Russia very, very insecure. And true enough, actually, because if you have seen what happened in Ukraine for the past many years, you can see that Ukraine is leaning more to NATO. And of course, the Western powers exploit this advantage. In one hand, you can see that Ukraine, they claim that we want to be an independent country. But actually, if you look closely, Ukraine is never being an independent country in the sense that it will never be under the influence of anybody. Ukraine is always under the influence of either under the influence of NATO or in the Russia. But in the past many years, you can see that, as Dr. Olsi mentioned earlier, that Ukraine is actually historically and also by identity part of Russia. So it is natural for Ukraine to be part of Russia, and Russia feel very protective of Ukraine. And if anybody came to Ukraine, try to take over Ukraine from Russia, that is naturally, they would react that way. So what is going on in Ukraine right now is actually in response to the NATO's expansion. But I think this point is not being properly discussed because that would actually put the intent or the motivation of the Western country came to NATO into question, because that is the big point here actually for Russia. The main reason for Russia to go to Ukraine is because to secure its national interest. Okay, and then you can see that there is people talking about the occupying another sovereign country. But actually, if you look in history, foreign occupation of another country is not a new thing in international politics, despite of international laws. You can see this thing happen in the 2001. United States occupied Afghanistan during the global war on terror. It's actually against the international law. It is against the Charter of United Nations, and it's against international norms. Occupying another countries and then cause a lot of trouble to that country, for Afghanistan. And it's actually before that, before America came to Afghanistan, the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan as well. And then you can see it's happened again in the case of Iraq 2003. United States went to Iraq to, they call it the Operation of Freedom, that is to remove Saddam's government. And it's happened again in Libya, it's happened again in Syria, but it never succeeded. It didn't happen. So now, United States and all the Western country, whenever it's happened in the case of Ukraine, they are preaching Russia for invading another country. And that is actually, if they reflect what happened to them, like 20 years ago, the Western powers, the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Western allies, they occupied a lot of Muslim countries too. They occupied Afghanistan, they occupied Iraq, and then they orchestrated a coup in Libya. And they removed government in Tunisia and many the Middle Eastern countries. So then now it's happened in the case of Russia. I think that they have forgotten, actually, they did the same thing in other countries as well. So now you can see that based on this example, the question of peace and conflict with regard to the global superpowers is actually something which has happened from time to time. You can see that it's happened before during Cold War and then after the post-Cold War right now. And now it's happened again in the 21st century. So I would say what determine or what define the peace and conflict in this world today is being determined or being decided by the superpowers. And today, I think that the conflict is happening again. The history repeat itself, and now we can see what happened in Ukraine. So that is point number 2. And then now point number 3 is Malaysia's position. I think that given the small states, Malaysia is a small state. Malaysia adopts the small state diplomacy in the sense that they do not ally with anybody. They take a neutral position. But of course, if you read the statement given by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia condemns the aggression against Ukraine. That's number 1. But they do not want to sanction Russia. But of course, sanctioning Russia for that matter is actually doesn't mean too much actually, because the trade between Malaysia and Russia and also in Ukraine is very small. I think that 0.5% of the entire trade that Malaysia have with other countries. So I think pressurizing Malaysia to sanction Russia doesn't affect anything. It's actually more on showing the support to the Western allies. And I think Malaysia take a very strategic position not to ally with either Russia for that matter, and also with the United States. So I think that's all from me now. I look forward for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad. So I believe both speakers have provided a very extensive and very informative description of what has been happening in the unfolding conflict in Russia and Ukraine. So in the first one, Dr. Osi has provided a very comprehensive account of the backdrop of what's happening in Ukraine right now, and also how the role of Russia as a major energy supplier as well as food supplier, in which the Europeans are very dependent upon, has affected the relationship between the two countries, and also how what was happening behind the scenes, aside from just the geopolitical interests between the two nations, but also the economic interests behind them as well. And for the second speaker, Dr. Ahmad also has succinctly provided a list of several international conventions, international agreements behind the European geopolitics, as well as the Malaysian position on it. So I think there will be a lot of interesting questions that we would like to dwell upon. And I think we have one first by Sheikh Akbar Ali. I think this is just a very quick question just about the statistics. I think this is directed to Dr. Olsi. The question is, Doctor, what are the casualty figures, number of people killed, military and civilian in Ukraine, and also among Russian soldiers? Thank you.
Well, it is very difficult to know the casualties, because if you hear the Russian medias, we have a different story. If you see the Western medias, we have different stories. But in general, we can say that the casualties up to now amount around to 5,000 to 6,000 from Russians and Russophones, while from the Ukrainian side is around almost 5,000. Nevertheless, we cannot exactly know what is really going on, because in this moment we have a number of cities like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, which are under military bombardment from the Russian army. And on the other hand, we have to know that Ukraine is a huge territory. So we can never know what is going on in this country. It is the size of Texas. And we can see even the advancement of the Russian army is taking so long. And something that I forgot to mention, that maybe we have to mention, since even the previous speaker, Dr. Ahmed just mentioned, is that Russians are trying to do a kind of surgical intervention in Ukraine, differently from what Americans have done in Syria or in Iraq or in Libya, where when the NATO armies, for example, intervened in Libya, they flattened the city of Sirte, or when they intervened in Mosul, they flattened Mosul by killing civilians, or they did the same thing in, I forgot the name, it was in my mind, of a city outside Fallujah. Well, the Russians are not doing that. And one of the reasons why we have so few victims in this moment of the war is that the Russians are trying to be very careful, because we have to know something, that Russians consider Ukrainians to be their brothers. So Ukrainians for Russians are like Syrians for Egyptians. So they are the same nation. They are Arabs in the case of Syrians and Egyptians, and they show they are very careful during their intervention not to cause major civilian casualties.
I would like to add one. Is that okay?
Please.
Yeah. Okay. There are 2 points I would like to mention here. Number one, actually, the war in Ukraine is not only the war between armies, but it also the war of ideas. It's the war of propaganda in one hand. If you follow the news from the Western countries and the news by Russia, we have two complete opposites. So I think here, the Western countries, Western media, they will actually showcase and they will highlight only destruction, a certain destruction, a certain point caused by the Russian army, and of course it's also, I mean, involves civilian casualties and it's involved refugees. And if you look at what being highlighted now in the media, in the Western media especially, what you can find is only talk about refugees, is talk about destruction of Ukraine, is talk about the success of the Ukraine army. It will never highlight, it will never show the way, what is the way forward? What is the role of peace here? I think the discourse in the media is actually to put Russia in the bad light, in the bad image. Well, I think it is to some extent, it works. The world has seen the world gang up together and West support that. Yes, of course, we don't deny that the war is a very bad business. It's involved, the casualty is involved, death. We can see this thing happen all over the world. That's why I think Malaysia take the right decision to condemn the act of aggression. But I think, as we can see right now, the whole world is watching Ukraine. And I think Dr. Olsi was right by mentioning that the war in Ukraine is not the war in Grozny, if you read history in Chechen. If you look at the Grozny style of the urban warfare, it was so different because that involved the massive destruction of the cities. But in the case of Ukraine, it's involved certain targeted location, especially military installation, because of, as Dr. Olsi mentioned, for Russian, Ukraine is part of them. It's part of their culture, part of their history, and their people is a part of them too, the Russian-speaking people. So I think destroying the country is not the option, and destroying the country is going to cause a lot of grievances to Ukrainian people. So that is number one. Another thing that I think we have to mention here is blindsided. I mean, there is a question by the Shari Ali mentioned, is a Russian blindsided by the global reaction in the invasion compared to the Crimea annexation? In my view, if you look at the behavior of the global superpower like United States, like Russia, and other countries like China, blindsided is not something that matters to them. If certain country, for example, United States or Russia, has locked their target, regardless of the global reaction, they don't care. You look what happened in Iraq, look what happened in Afghanistan, look what happened in Ukraine at the moment. You look at what happened in the case of China coming to Malaysian airspace, claiming that this is part of the military exercise and this is part of the China's South China Sea. Do you think that global superpower would care for the reaction of the other countries? We are talking about the global superpower. It's not a small country. So blindsided is not something that really matters too much to them. So that's my response to the question. Thank you.
Yes.
May I add something to what Dr. Ahmad
yes,
said?
please. Yes,
okay, I'm sorry for intervening. I just wanted to, in a way, add more to what Dr. Ahmad said and for our public, and to, I mean, strengthen his point. Number one, regarding Ukrainian refugees. Now, I have visited Russia and much of Eastern Europe, and I want to explain something to our viewers. As of now, we have around 2.5 million Ukrainians who have left the country and are going towards Western Europe, in particular Germany. Americans, they use Germany as the country where they can deposit war refugees from all over Europe, and this is their policy of keeping Germany down. But something that I have to explain to our viewers is that most of those Ukrainians who are at this moment fleeing towards Western Europe are not doing this only because of the war. For people who know the desperate situation of many Eastern European countries, let us say from Kosovo to Macedonia to Moldavia, etc. If these people will have an open door policy like Ukrainians are having, they are going to flee en masse. It is the same situation as the people of Myanmar. If somebody will open the doors of Myanmar and will tell them, okay, now you can all go to Singapore or to Malaysia because you have war, you'll have millions of people who are going to come here not to flee the war, but for economic reasons. Number two is we see such a great Western hypocrisy in this moment when they speak about Russia and Ukraine. And you see all this kind of humanism coming out of the West, and they condemn Russia. Of course, the war is condemnable. Nobody can defend the war. But these very same Western governments and Americans in particular, they are discriminating poor Syrians who are in refugee camps throughout Turkey and Greece since 2014. And these poor Syrians and Palestinians and Afghans and Iraqis, they are not allowed to get asylum in Western Europe, as Ukrainians are doing. And for people who follow media like Al Jazeera or Russia Today, you probably would have seen the open discrimination that Polish guards are doing to Muslims, to Indians, and to Asians who were in Ukraine and are trying to flee the war. They are not allowing them to enter. And for our viewers, we have to remind them about what happened in Belarus a few weeks ago, where we had some thousands of Syrians and Iraqis who wanted to enter and to take asylum in the European Union because of the wars that Europeans made and the destruction of the states of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, that countries like Ukraine, Poland, and others who are part or who joined the Americans in these aggressions, and Europeans didn't allow them in. And something that I have to clarify for our viewers is that the war in Ukraine, apart from the gas dimension, apart from the clash of two superpowers, which are the Americans and Russians, is even a war of civilization. For the Russians, Ukraine is a holy place. In January 2019, Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, declared that Ukraine is not the periphery of our church. We call Kyiv the mother of all Russian cities. For us, Kyiv is what Jerusalem is for many. Russian Orthodoxy began there. So under no circumstances can we abandon this historical and spiritual relationship. Now, what has happened in Ukraine, especially since 2014, we had a number of very powerful Jewish oligarchs, and we have to stress this, people from Soros to Kolomonsky, who brought in power people who came through their organizations, like Open Society Institute of Soros, and who these people, they're not Muslim, they're not Orthodox Christian. So let us put ourselves in the shoes of the Orthodox Christians of Ukraine. What would people say in Malaysia if, let us say, Soros will build a foundation here and will make the prime minister and the sultan of Malaysia somebody who is not a Muslim, but who is a Jew. And this is a question that even ex-Prime Minister Medvedev made to Zelensky a few months ago, when Zelensky was threatening Russia, and he told to the Russian speakers of Ukraine, he told to them, you have two options. One, to speak Ukrainian and to renounce your Russian identity, or two, you go back to Russia. And in that moment, ex-Prime Minister Medvedev responded to Zelensky and told him, who are you to talk in such a way to the Russians of Ukraine? Are you a Jew? Are you a Tatar? Or what are you? So what has happened especially since 2014 in Ukraine, we're having a clash of civilization. On one side, for those of you who probably are not very well acquainted with the policies of the Democrats and the left in Europe, there is a promotion of the destruction of family, of the LGBT agenda, and the attack against religion. So Russians, for those of you who have visited Russia, but Ukrainians as well, they're very religious people. So they do not tolerate when you insult their religion. But what has happened in the past years, there is an open attack against Christianity, and in particular against the Russian Orthodox Church. Ukrainian government has created another church called the Ukrainian Church, and they have been forcefully invading Russian Orthodox churches who are directed by the Patriarchate of Moscow, and even killing believers inside their churches. So we have a religious conflict as well, where in one side we have a Zionist Jew like Mr. Zelensky, who is the president of Ukraine. The prime minister is also, but the majority of the population is Christian Orthodox. So this is a point, I think, that can help us to contemplate and to understand the tension that exists between Russia and Ukraine and within the Ukrainian society itself. What will happen if this thing will happen in a country like Malaysia? There will be riots. So we have to understand that the Orthodox Christians of Ukraine and Russia have been provoked and offended in a continuous way. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have a couple of questions here, but maybe if we can go back to the question by Mr. Ashari Ali. Maybe Dr. Ahmad already answered that. Maybe Dr. Olsi, can you respond to the question whether Russia is blindsided by the global reaction compared to the Crimea annexation? Because it seems that the sanctions and the embargo for this time is much more severe. Or maybe you can give a quick comparison between the two.
The Russians are not blindsided by it is. I don't call it a global reaction, but I'd like to call it a Western or Anglo-American reaction to the invasion, because let us say people in Myanmar or in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, they do not care why Russia is attacking Ukraine. But of course, the Russian administration, they tried for as long as they could to avoid the military intervention. Russians, they were begging the Americans, the Europeans, the NATO. They had a Minsk agreement with Ukrainians after the coup that happened in Kyiv in 2014. And according to the Minsk agreement, it was stated that Ukraine will respect the rights of the Russians and the Russian Orthodox Christian and their linguistic and religious realities within Ukraine. So Russians, they begged, they wanted to make a multicultural Ukraine like Malaysia is, like Great Britain, like Canada is. But what they faced arrogance, provocation, mass killings. And I know that in this moment, the Russian administration is very worried about the global backlash that is coming towards her. But this is not the first time that the Russians are in such a situation. Napoleon tried to do this thing, and Europeans did the same thing against the Soviets. But we have to bear something in mind, that Russia is the biggest country of our planet. They are 1/5 of our planet. So, I mean, they can trade with China, they can trade with Central Asia and the rest of Europe. So if you see the map of Russia, Europe is just a small part where they face the West.
Yes.
I would like to add a little bit. It's
yes,
possible?
Please.
Yeah, okay. There are 3 points I would like to mention here. One is the war in Ukraine is actually about the question about maintaining hegemony of the Western powers. Maintaining hegemony, especially by the United States, matters a lot actually in the unipolar world today. Because if you read history, during the Cold War, maybe we talk about the unipolar world in which there are two global power existed. One hence is the United States led NATO, and the other one is Russian bloc, the Warsaw Pact. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 90s, the America is left as the sole guardian of, in the word of Fukuyama, sole guardian of democracy. That is the victory for democracy. But I think for the Russian, it doesn't matter a lot. Okay, you can take it, you can maintain your hegemony as the sole superpower, but whenever the NATO start to expand to the east, which is much closer to Russia, then I think the violent reaction is coming up. So I think this situation happened because it's related to the second point. I do not know. What I sense is that the problem which is taking place in Europe right now, actually it's not the problem of European people. It's actually the problem which is being imposed by the United States on the European people by bringing their sense of insecurity to European countries, as well as the need to maintain their hegemony. But actually, if you look at in the past, European continent has been in war for so many years, and they got fed up with the war. They don't want to get in war anymore. And suddenly the war happened because of the, as I said, the violent reaction by the Russian against the expansions of NATO eastward, which is actually close to Russia. So actually, it is not the problem of European people, European countries. Even if you look at Germany, which is a very, very much close to Russia, there is one military general, I think the Vice Admiral, Vice Admiral K. Achim Schonberg, I think his name. He was saying that what is needed by Russia is a high-level respect, meaning for the Western powers, say that, okay, this is my territory, please don't come near to that, because this is going to make Russia feel very insecure as a superpower too in that continent. And then I think that the relationship between Germany and Russia is improving. I mean, how can you ignore that Russia is a part of Europe? It is impossible. It is impossible to ignore Russia as a part of Europe. It is impossible to ignore and to never try to establish a better relationship with Russia, which is part of European continent. I think it is impossible. So I believe that the European people, they want to establish a closer relationship with Russian as a people, as a country, and they did that. That's why, as mentioned by Dr. Olsi just now, the trade relation between countries and then the dependence of European countries to Russian energy was almost 40%. That it actually indicate. I mean, if I use international relation construct theory, they call it constructivism. Whenever each country is constructing the social relationship in terms of trade, in terms of mobility, and so on and so forth, because there is a strong mobility in the age of globalization. The Russian business, they move to Europe, they move to London. So because of this, then the relationship getting closer. However, because of the geopolitics, because of the need to maintain the hegemony, then I think the conflict start to go southward. I mean, something start to go wrong. And then now, if you talk about embargo, the main purpose of embargo is to make Russia suffer and surrender to the need, to the will of the Western powers, to stop the war and to get out from Ukraine. But actually, on the flip side, it also hurt the Western countries as well. And I think that's the reason why they gathered in Versailles in France recently. I think last week they gathered in Versailles. And I don't remember, Dr. Olsi, when that was. I mean, during the World War I, the gathering was held in the Versailles Palace. Is that correct?
Yes, the peace conference of 2019.
Yes. Okay. So I mean, now it never happened before, and suddenly in 2022, it's happened again, just to show that the Western powers united against the aggressors in European continent. I think what is going on in Ukraine right now is a very, very big things, and we are in this region. We have to be very careful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have 3 more questions. I don't know if we can fit all of it. So the next question is, Muslims should not easily take sides in the Ukraine-Russia conflict today. What is your stand on this? And maybe if I can add the role of Chechen fighters in the Russian army. So maybe both of you can quickly respond on the role of Muslims, or maybe the Islamic side of it. Begin with Dr. Olsi, please.
Yes, if I can speak like a Muslim, I would say that, look, if we see the geopolitical realities of our world since the fall of Soviet Union, the fall of Russia and Soviet Union was a major disaster for our planet. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Indonesia with East Timor, and you name it, were not going to be attacked by Western powers and turn to Stone Age. So if we forget what the war brings to people, from the geostrategical point of view, I think that the war in Ukraine is good for the Muslim world. Why? Because if I can repeat what Dato Mahathir Mohamad used to tell to us in 1990s, in 2000, when Americans attacked Afghanistan, by having a bipolar world, where in one side we have the Russians and on the other hand we have the Americans, the world will be better for Muslim countries. The Americans will not dare to bomb Iraq, and like they did Syria, Yemen, Libya, and all Muslim countries like they have done in the past 30 years. The Russian military intervention in Syria and the protection of the Syrian state from the plan that the Zionists and Americans had for dismantling of Syria came thanks to the Russian intervention. Turkey in 2016, when the Americans organized a coup d'etat with the Gulenists, was saved thanks to the Russian intervention. Russia is arming Turkey with S-400 defense systems. So in a way, the conflict that we see nowadays in Ukraine, I believe that if we see it in the long term, is not that bad for Muslims, because finally we are having a bipolar world. This is my perspective. Regarding the Chechens who fight for Russia in this moment, I think they are doing exactly what, let us say, the Chinese or the Indians of Malaysia will do in case if Malaysia will go to war with another country. We have to bear in mind something, that almost 20% of the population of Russia is Muslim. Russia as a country is a member of the OIC. And if you go to Russia, Russians, they say that Islam is part of our country. And differently from Western, in the West, where Islam is very often equated with terrorism, and especially since 11 September, you read and see in the media terms such as Islamic terrorism and what have you. In Russia, is legally prohibited to insult Islam and to equate Islam with terrorism. It is true that the Russians, they fought with the Chechens in the 1990s, but now they have done peace, and Chechens are citizens of Russia, and what they are doing is they are fighting for their mother country. Simple.
Yes, thank you very much. I think maybe if Dr. Ahmad can also respond, maybe from a Malaysian perspective of how Malaysians are showing their support for either of the countries, and maybe what was the impetus or maybe what's the sentiment behind them.
Well, actually, in Malaysia, I think we have a tradition, I think, in our foreign policy. Whenever, I mean, if you look at in what happened during Cold War, we join the policy, we adopt the policy of a non-alignment. I think as a small country, it is very difficult. I mean, it will put a certain country in a very difficult situation if you take the against or pro with certain country and against certain country, because the situation might change in the future. I think that the policy of a non-alignment is the best policy, and I think Malaysia has done the right things by doing so. And I just want to highlight one example, I mean, which has happened now with the United States after the sanction of energy. American consumers also suffer, European consumers also suffered because of their dependence on the Russian energy. And right now, America tried to reach the tried to reach the Gulf country like Saudi Arabia and UAE. So because of the problem which is happened after the Biden's takeover as the president of the United States, Biden has adopted a very, very strong position against these two countries, especially in Saudi Arabia, in the case of Yemen, and then UAE. I mean, the relation between these two countries become a very cool, and I mean, unlike during Trump's, the relationship is more friendly and more cordial. So right now, as you can see, the situation has changed in favor of Russia. The situation has changed in favor of China, because the China and right now can trade with Russia. They increase their trade with Russia, definitely, because there was a vacancy and withdrawal from the Western power from engaging with Russia. That's number one. And what happened to the United States is actually very much worse, because this Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE, refused to speak to the American president, used to engage with the American government and try to help them, because you were actually was bad to me before. So that was the perception, and say that they don't want to entertain the call. So, I mean, that is the price that you have to pay whenever you take position. I mean, in this case, the United States, you're strongly against certain things, and actually it worked against you in the future. And I think I also want to mention about the foreign fighters. The business of foreign fighters, I mean, the case of a certain war which has happened in another country, and we have people from outside going to fight in that country, is a very, very risky business. We have seen this thing happen in Afghanistan. We've seen this happen in Syria. I really hope that will not happen in the case of Ukraine, because we do not know what's going down after that. And yeah, I think there is a question here by the Syed Akbar Ali. The latest news say that President Zelensky wants to talk directly with Ms. Putin in Israel with the intermediary. And I don't have any comment on that. Maybe Dr. Olsi can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comment, Dr. Ahmed. Regarding to the question by Mr. Said Akbar regarding Israel, yes, Israel plays a very important role in the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia for a number of reasons. Number one, I have to remind your viewers that majority of Israelis who are today in Israel, they are not Ben Israel. They are not the Yahudis of the Quran, but they are Ashkenazim Jew. which means they are Russian or Ukrainians who practice Judaism, who converted into Judaism at around 800, at the year around 800. And when the state of Israel was created, these are the people who went to Israel. And people from Benjamin Netanyahu to Ariel Sharon, Shimon Peres, but even Bennett today in Israel, these people are Ukrainians and Russians and Poles. So for them, Ukraine is like their homeland. And moreover, Zelensky is their relative, is their cousin. And if you see Jewish rabbis on the internet, they make prayers for Zelensky. There was one Jewish scholar who made even a video a few days ago, and who was saying Ukraine is the second Israeli state that we have, because the president and the prime minister are Jews. So for Israel, they are very worried about the Russian intervention in Ukraine, because they want to protect their own people. Their own people have power, and most of the oligarchs that control the wealth of Ukraine, they're Ashkenazi Jews. So that's why Israel want to take part in what goes on, because they want to protect their own people.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we have like 5 to 10 minutes more time. So I think one more question. We have received several questions from Facebook. So maybe I can just merge them together from Fazlullah Suhaimi and also from Jack Chan. So basically the question is about how war is can never be justified, and also maybe from the perspective of Ukraine as a country in itself, as a sovereign country, why shouldn't they get to decide for their own interests? So basically that's the two questions. War can never be justified, and what about the perspective of Ukrainians and what they want for their country? So maybe if you both of you can respond very quickly, like 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Let me start one. I agree with Suhaimi, who mentioned that the war will never be justified. Yes, I agree with that. That's why I say that Malaysia has take the right stance, condemning the act of aggression committed by the Russian army. And of course, the war is never being justified in that manner. And I think by doing so, he has changed the history of European people into this world. And the second thing is, I believe that the best way forward for the Ukraine is the policy of non-alignment. What I mean by non-alignment is that Ukraine need to be a neutral state, not being under influence of the of NATO and also in Russia, in the case of Russia. But however, given the proximity or the closeness of Ukraine to Russia, I think that Ukraine, in the interest of both sides, in the interest of Ukraine and also in the interest of Russia, as they share the similar destiny, identity and history and religion, they need to be concerned with the security of the Russia, and therefore by securing the security of Russia, they also ensure the security of its own. So again, I would like to repeat, my position in this discussion is that we never justify the war in Ukraine because it's involved the cost of life and it's a cost of destruction. I think the best way forward would be the call for peace. I mean, in the case of Muslim countries, I would like to add this now, beside the policy of non-alignment, the Muslim countries and all other countries actually for that matter, the family of nation need to call for peace and need to call for the cessation of hostilities. Thank you.
Very nicely put by Dr. Ahmad. And maybe Dr. Osi, you can comment and maybe we can brief this webinar, inshallah.
Yeah, so coming back to the question about the intervention of Russia and the war, is that Russians, they never wanted to go to war with Ukraine. Ukraine is a big headache for Russia because if you know the country is very poor. And even if you see the history of the Soviet Union, Russians used to spend so much money to maintain Ukraine. And if you know even the history of Ukraine after the fall of communism, it is mainly a failed state which lives on loans from IMF and the European bankers. So, but the Russians did the most they could to stop Ukraine from hosting military bases of an aggressive power against them, which is the United States. The same thing would have been done even by the British if, let us say, Russians would have gone to France and would have put their rockets against London, directed towards London. The same would have done the Americans if the Russians would have gone to Canada and put Canada under their military alliance and send their rockets and armies and tanks in the American borders. So, I mean, we have to understand great power diplomacy, and we have to understand why the Russians did what they did, which Russians, they avoided to do this for a long time. But, I mean, what the Russians are doing now, they're implementing the so-called Monroe Doctrine that Americans implemented in America during the Cold War and during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're doing the exact thing that the Americans would have done. And moreover, look, the war in Ukraine came because its leadership wanted to join an aggressive military alliance, which is called NATO, which has a very bad precedent. And moreover, if we follow American policymakers, from American congressmen up to Zbigniew Brzezinski, the whole strategy of a US administration, or even if you read Samuel Huntington, Americans, they said openly that they want a global domination, but for them to reach this global domination, they have to militarily defeat Russia, China, and the Muslim world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olsi. I think that will be a good wrap for our webinar today. Both of the presentations by our esteemed speakers, I think, is very informative, very detailed, very enlightening, and I think would definitely spark a lot of critical and very important discussions in the future, inshallah. And on behalf of IAIS Malaysia, I would like to thank both our speakers, Dr. Ahmad and Dr. Olsi, and also those who have joined us from this morning and until the afternoon. And hopefully we can see you guys later in our other talk series. So with that, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and see you again.
Thank you very much, Wan. Thank you very much, Dr. Olsi. It's a pleasure to meet you here.
Thank you very much.